Well, good afternoon, good evening, good morning. Welcome to a very special episode of the AUA Ask Us Anything. So, first of all, today is not the last Tuesday of the month. We already did that a couple of days ago. Second of all, today is only me. Josh is not available. Only because of such short notice. The reason that I want to do a bonus episode is that last Tuesday when we did the original AUA, we had some technical difficulty with the streaming platform that we're using, and so we had to switch to a different platform. And in the midst of that, I didn't turn on the correct microphone, and so my audio quality was very poor. So I wanted to kind of redo my portion, and also thinking that maybe I'll put it in a different context. So the last Tuesday, the episode title was how to meditate or how to practice in the desire realm. We talk about the three different realms of existence: the desire realm, the form realm, the formless realm. And that was a good title to kind of tie together what Josh was talking about and what I was talking about. But actually, the two parts were originated separately from some questions, especially my part was originated by a question asked specifically by a student who, after he started practicing with us, he wanted to know whether or not he can utilize the meditation technique to be quote unquote closer to God. And this is not the first time that I had students who were Christians. Actually, most of our work is somewhat agnostic. I would even argue that if we practice Buddhism at all, Buddhism itself is not a religion. But also, I have a friend who is a deacon in his church, and he and I have been having a lot of discussions because, as you know, 2 years ago when we had the 3-day retreat with Master Jiru, we actually had it in a Catholic facility down in the South Bay Area, which kind of combined Catholicism and meditation. So I've been always interested, particularly the Zen meditation. So I've been very, very interested in understanding the relationship between mindfulness meditation and the worship of God. And so today I'm going to redo the presentation, hopefully with much better audio quality, but also a slightly twist in that I want to answer the question that was posed to me, which was how to meditate with God. Now you notice that I put God in quote, and I meant that as a respect, because I really don't have much of understanding of who God is and what He represents. I have some idea, and I don't want to be disrespectful to my friends and my student, so I put it in quote for that reason. So the question was, how do you meditate? How do you meditate with God? Or more specifically, how do we use the mindfulness meditation for the purpose of getting closer to God? So the first question I have is a simple one, which is, who is God? All right. Again, I put it in quote, our respect. Who is God? And so this started my own soul searching, which is, what do I know about God, and what other people, what people when if they worship God, how do they define God? And so, in this case, I use what I call the Abrahamic religion, right? Which, as you know, Abraham was sort of the commonality between Judaism, Christianity, which combines, which includes Protestants and Catholics, as well as the Islam, right? We all know that, and so I use that. Actually, Abrahamic religion is a big part of what is called monotheist religion, which is that in their religion there's only one God. So the word God is used in many religions, including the Chinese religion, but in this case, we typically use the lowercase God as one of the God. But in this case, God is singular. There's only one God. And so in this case, we say God is the Almighty. God is the creator of the universe. He's also the sole ruler of the universe and the source of all moral authority, right? So we understand that. That's what I understand God to be for my friends who believes in worshiping God. And so then the question is, God is therefore a destiny, right? Because our job here on earth is to fulfill the program that has been set up by God, right? So which kind of, and for me, that's why I'm not a Christian, at least not yet, is that I have problems struggling with that. I rather believe that I can control my destiny, which might be a foolish thing. But in any case, that's where I am now, because I really like to think that I'm my own master. And so if God becomes the Almighty, then where does it leave me? What is the purpose of my existence then, other than serve God? And maybe that is a good enough purpose, and it's definitely a good enough purpose for many of my friends. But in any case, as I dig into more and more about who is God, I read the Bible. Of course, Genesis is an important document. In there it says God created mankind, both Adam and Eve, in his own image. So then I have to ask the question, which is God human? That's not possible. That's ridiculous, right? Because I am a human, Adam and Eve are human. If God created Adam and Eve, our ancestor, in his image, does that mean God is human? That can't be true, right? So we know that God is not human. So what does that mean? Because what does it mean that God is not human, but yet he created us in his image? Does that mean we are God? Does that mean that once upon a time we were God? Does it mean that once upon a time we were much closer in image and in appearance or to God? That's a question, right? That is a question. And finally, the question comes up, me being not a Christian, is other religions have God too, or other monotheist religion, whether it is Islam or even the Hindu religion, at least the ancient Hindu religion, where they worship Brahma. Brahma is in fact the creator God, the God in the Hindu religion that created university. So are God, Allah, and Brahma the same? Because they kind of look the same. For those who are outside of all these religions, they kind of look the same, right? But obviously, when you talk to a Christian, they say, no, God is different from Allah. And when you talk to a Muslim, obviously they're different. So how different are they? Right? That's another question. Now, of course, we're from more modern days, and especially in my work, I'm very interested in. I talk about the volunteer work that I done in a very small capacity inside the prisons, and inside the prisons they deal with a lot of addiction, and then I learn about how they help people with that, and then I kind of thought about the parallel between people who are addicted to drugs versus people who are addicted to emotions, sensations. So I start to study the 12 steps of AA, Alcoholic Anonymous, which was originated by two very good Christians, one being a medical doctor and one was, I believe, was actually a clergy. In any case, in their document, now of course, maybe not in the original document, but as that program evolved, they actually broadened the definition of God to be God as you understand him. Now, of course, nowadays they put her. So in other words, as the definition evolved, we are much more open now to some other possibilities, some other possible definition of God. In any case, those are the questions I have, and so I want to go a little further, Because without understanding who God is, I can't answer the question. Or if without having some kind of agreement on who God is, I can't begin to answer the question, the original question, which was how to meditate with God, right? So, so I want to take a step back and talk about God in the context of our existence. What are the possible dimensions of our existence? And so you might say, well, your existence is in your body and in your soul, right? So that would be what a Christian would talk about. And then now, of course, in my own study as a meditator, as a Buddhist, we tend to go further than that. And so the next slide is talk about the three dimensions of existence: the body, the energy, and the mind, right? So especially if you ever come to our Saturday practice, we talk a lot about our energy body. And so here it's important that I keep track of the original language, which in the case of body is the Pali word kaya. And in the mind, they talk about sita. And so it's important to keep track of that, because typically when I talk about body, we're talking about, the body as the eye, the nose, the ear, the mouth, the hands, perhaps the inner organs and so forth. That is being a body. But in this case, actually, Gaia is everything that is physical about us. So one definition of that is that everything that ceases to exist when you die. So it's important to keep in mind that in this case, when we talk about body, we're talking about quote unquote a mind, right? But in this case, we're really talking about a thinking mind, what I call the thinking mind, or more precisely, we're talking about a brain. So very often we don't make the distinction between a mind versus a brain. We think that they're the same. So in the context of the Buddhist teaching, they're different. They are actually different. The body is the mind, the brain is part of the body, right? The energy is actually not talked about so much in the Buddhist teaching, but in the Chinese, especially in the Taoist teaching, that's the important part. That's the important part. So we talk about in the Saturday study practice, we talk about both the physical body and the energy body. The energy body being a reflection of your physical body. So we talk about the chi lines, the energy lines, the 12 secondary and the 2 primary. So we did that. So if you want to know more, you can come to our Saturday class, right? But it's important to keep track that the energy body is a separate body. It's a separate dimension of our existence. So finally, there's the mind. And so if you want to dig a little deeper, which we will do in the future, but not today, that in this case, when we talk about mind, we're actually talking about the consciousness. But again, it's outside of the brain, okay? So just kind of give you a taste of what we're not. We're talking about what would be called the 7 and the 8 consciousness. The 7 consciousness is what we call the mono consciousness. The 8 consciousness is what we call the alaya consciousness. So you hear about the word karma, and so the karma is in fact the anaya consciousness, the 8 consciousness. But anyway, enough of that. Now, being a engineer and a scientist, it's important for me to reconcile between what I learned as a Buddhist and what I learned as an engineer scientist. So in the science field, we also talk about existence in 3 domains. We talk about the particle, the wave, right? So the particle obviously is material. The wave in this case obviously is the energy. And then we talk about something else that is beyond particle and wave, what we call quantum information. So information is data. So in that sense, there's a perfect parallel between what the scientists talk about and what the Buddhists talk about. Because in this case, when we say quantum information, that is in fact our karma, 8 consciousness. It's a record, right? It's a record. And also, and of course, among the physicists, they talk about what is called the duality, the particle wave duality. That says that material and energy is interchangeable, right? The very famous E equal mc squared equation from Einstein talks exactly about that, right? So that the duality or the equivalence between particle and wave is in fact the underlying physics behind atomic bomb, right? That you can take two atoms, smash them together, and the result is that you have lose a little bit of mass, and the mass turns into this tremendous amount of atomic energy. And the reverse of that is true, right? So that's what we call the Big Bang. This is how the universe was created, which is the opposite of that, taking energy, tremendous amount of energy, and creating, in this case, particles that finally forms planets. So the question is where does God fit into all this? Is God a particle, a wave, or information? I'm not saying that God necessarily have to be one or a combination of those, but how does our understanding of God or our desire to understand God reconcile with our understanding of our own existence, right? So I want to stay with the science a little bit because it's important to explore that question. So Einstein was a rather recent scientist, right? And he came up with something called relativity. And so up until then, the belief is that time is absolute. That is, your time and my time have to be absolute. Your clock and my clock have to be identical. That was sort of the assumption. There's no reason to assume otherwise. Now it turns out that Einstein pursued relativity for a very different reason. He was actually trying to explain that there is no such thing as ether. Ether was the idea that you need medium to transfer energy. So you know that like in vacuum you can't have sound because there's no medium for the sound wave. So you have to have either air or like the railroad rail, right? So remember the movie where you put your ears next to the railroad rail and then the rail and you can hear the train coming. So acoustic energy needs some kind of medium to transfer energy. And up until Einstein, the belief was that there had to be some kind of medium between the planets. Otherwise, how could light be transmitted from one point to another? And Einstein actually started out by disapproving that, this called ether. In the process, he decided that he needed to make some assumption, and the assumption was that time is relative. There's no reason for time to be the same. So he made a joke. Now, I have no way of knowing whether that quote is correct, but it's been quoted so many times, I just assume that it's true, and if it's not true, I will make it true, right? So where he says, well, there's no reason for time to be constant, because if you are with a nice girl, you would rather be there forever. So a second might seem like an hour, and whereas if you're sitting on top of a cinder, a red hot cinder, then a second an hour would seem like a second when you have a nice girl, and then the reverse of that is that if you're sitting on top of a hot cinder where you're very uncomfortable, then a second would seem like an hour. Okay, so he kind of make a joke on that. So a lot of things fall out from that, and I'll talk about the consequence of his belief that time is relative. But one of the things that also fall out from that, or one of the things that was an important assumption, because in order for him to state that time is relative, he also made another assumption, and that assumption actually turned out to be very, very significant, although it's almost never talked about, which is that the only thing constant in our universe is the speed of light. Now, the physicists actually call the speed of light the speed of causality. So in other words, the speed of causality is absolute in our universe. Now, this is pretty amazing if you think about it from a Buddhist context. It says that there is cause and effect in everything that we do. So last time and the time before, we talked about kusala, wholesome thoughts. So if you were to have a wholesome thoughts, that wholesome thought would lead to wholesome action. That's called causality, right? Good seeds, good fruit. Bad seeds, bad fruit. So if you made a mistake, you would have to suffer the consequence. And what this says is that the speed of the causality is the same whether you're an enlightened being or not. It is the same for everyone. It doesn't say that just because you are a layman that you necessarily suffer a faster consequence versus someone else who might. It doesn't say that. This is the ultimate. This is the ultimate equality, that we all suffer our consequence at the same rate. This is amazing, right? Anyway, so what does it mean when you say that time is relative? So if you look at the left picture, this is Einstein looking at various ways of measuring time. And so what he's basically saying is that time is not constant because it has to do with your frame of reference. So if you're standing there, with the hourglass, time is one thing. If you're sitting on a train going one direction at some slow speed, is something else. And if you're going at a much faster speed, that's something else. So that's why he said that time cannot be constant. But he actually said more. He actually talks a lot about time and space. And what's interesting is that if you look at the hourglass, he's measuring time in terms of that particle, that piece of sand going from the top to the bottom. And Einstein basically says that the only reason that you would have time is because if you have space. In other words, if you have no place to go, why do you worry about how fast you're going? If you get stuck in the traffic, what does $100,000 Porsche would do for you? You can't go anywhere, right? So this is actually very interesting that because you have space, you have time. And because you have time, you have space. And because you have time, you can measure decay. And then you can separate the difference between a particle, which is material, versus energy. And in the process of arguing that there's no ether, there's no medium. In other words, light as electromagnetic energy does not need a medium to transfer. He's basically saying that light doesn't dissipate over time. Energy doesn't dissipate over time. Now you might say, well, that's not true. That's not true. When I look at a star that is very far away, it's very dim. Well, yes, because the intensity went down. Because as the light emanated from a star, it covers more and more surface area, right? So therefore, as it goes, if the star is very far away, you would see it as very dim. But the total amount of energy that comes out from the star doesn't change over time. So in other words, if your world consists of particle and wave, then the time varies, whether you have a region in the universe where you have very high density of particle versus an area where you have much lower density of particle. And so the time would vary, right? In fact, you can make the argument that if you would go to a region in space where there is no more particle, it's just pure energy, then time ceases to exist. And then you have all the way in between. So actually, one way to understand gravity is that it is actually not a force, but it's a desire. It's a natural desire for a particle to want to go from a region where time is short to a region where time is where he can live longer, basically. So you have a place where 1 second equal to 1 hour. There's a tendency for the particle to go to the place where it's only 1 second, because he wants to live longer. Now, no one ever explained it like that, but that's how I understand it. So then, eventually, people who understood Einstein came up with this concept of a black hole, which is that as these particles come together, they become so dense that they would actually become energy. and then particle would cease to exist, that the gravitational force becomes infinite. And so you have something called the singularity, where all the particles fall into this black hole and they cease to exist because they get all converted into wave. And so the singularity is a place where there is no space, there is no time, and there's no particle. And then if you start from there and then you move away from the singularity, then you have different time, right? So you start with 1 second equal to 1 hour, 1 second equal to 1 day, 1 second equal to 50 days, 1 second equal to 1 year, and so forth. As you move away from that black hole, the time gets longer and longer and longer. Now this, I still want to talk about this a little bit more, because this is important in our understanding of the existence of God, the possible existence of God, possible understanding of God, because I wanted to start with a current understanding, scientific understanding of our universe and our dimensions of existence. So I want to bring you to a movie, and this is one of my favorite movies. But before I do that, I want to introduce you to someone I met at Caltech. I was actually there, I believe I was there in the early 90s. I used to teach at UCLA, and in my sabbatical, I went to Caltech as a research scientist. And I don't know Dr. Thorne, Professor Thorne personally, but I used to see him at the faculty club with Stephen Hawkins. So they were buddies. And now, of course, they're very famous people. So, I get my own kids table, and these big guys sit at. But in any case, Dr. Thorne is an amazing guy. Okay, so just look at the numbers. So he was born in 1940. By the time he was 25 years old, he received his PhD. 2 years later, he became a full professor at Caltech. That is amazing. People would take decades to do that. Took him 2 years, right? So most of the time, I was an assistant professor at UCLA. It took us 6 years, which is the fastest we can actually get promoted into an associate professor. And that could take another 10 years before you become a professor. So it took him 2 years. And so he finally retired. So I was there in the early 90s, and he basically retired in the late 2000. So he was there when I was there, definitely. He is an expert in what's called gravitational physics and astrophysics, right? So that's what we've been talking about, black hole and all that. And he recently, after he retired, he recently received his Nobel Prize for his contribution in gravitational wave. Now, you know that one of the requirements for receiving a Nobel Prize is that someone actually has proven the validity of your theory. So in his case, his work in gravitational wave was actually proven by himself and other people. In the case of Stephen Hawkins, at the time of his death, he still wasn't able to get a Nobel Prize because his stuff has not been proven yet. We're getting close. We still haven't proven his contribution yet. Now, interesting as a side note, Einstein's relativity was not proven in his lifetime. And so they actually gave him a Nobel Prize that 1 year when they couldn't find anybody else, and they just picked some random things that he did and just gave him the Nobel Prize for that. In any case, right around the time when he was getting ready to retire, he got really interested in movies. And so he actually collaborated into one of my favorite movies called Interstellar. And he was the writer, and he was also the responsible for all the technical work. And so in this case, they're talking about space travel. And so I just want to mention something called time dilation, which basically is the name given for the fact that time is relative. So you could have, so in this case, I just want to use an example where there was a planet called Planet Miller. And Planet Miller was actually right at the edge of the black hole. The black hole in this case is called a gargantua. If you have seen the movie, you know what I'm talking about. And they were just supposed to go down to the planet to explore, to see if there's any survivors. And they thought that they would just be there for a very short time. And then they had some mechanical difficulties, then get stuck there for 3 hours. Now it turns out that every hour on the planet Miller, because it's so close to the black hole, that every hour they're equivalent to 7 years on Earth. So by the time they return to the orbiting spacecraft, the colleague that they left behind who were of the same age as they are, which would probably be in the early 30s, had aged 20 years. So that was the movie. That talks about the relativity of time, that how different parts of the universe could have a different time, and the time could all related to the idea of whether or not you have quote unquote contamination by the material. If you get to a place like the singularity of black hole where there's no more material, then time stands still. So the Buddhists basically have the same idea. So if I were to chart that, I would just kind of say, okay, here's the singularity where time stands still, and then I move away from that to Planet Miller where 1 hour equal to 7 years, and then just keep going until you get back onto Earth. Then essentially you would get to this chart right here. Now, going back to what Einstein says, that if you are sitting on heart center, you would be way down here, because here is where human resides. So somewhere in here it consists of the planet Earth, which consists of the humans and the animals right down here. And next to that is what's called a hell. Now, obviously, the definition of hell here must be very different from the definition among the Christians, right? But in any case, there's something called a hell. There's something called the hungry ghost. There's something called Azura. So this is a region in the universe that are below what's considered below humans, and then there's something above the human, and then there's something above that. And so when you get to the very top, is probably what Einstein referred to as hot girl. And again, I put it in quote because I want to be politically correct, but I'm just using Einstein's word that, where you just wish that time would never cease to exist, right? So that gives you the chart. Now, of course, we separate that, like we talked about last time, into 3 different regions. And this is what we call the Kama Luka, which is the realm of the desire. But it's actually, the word actually meant desire and sense. So it's because we have this body, because we have these sensors, that we are open to sensations. And because of the sensation, we get very attached to them. So we have this desire to be immersed into our sensation. So this realm is called the desire realm, and it consists of the human, the animal, the hungry ghost, the hell, and 6 other what is called the heavenly realm. And again, I don't believe that this is the same heaven as what my friend, a Christian friend, thinks of heaven. It might be not. I'm not insisting it, but it talks about these. Now, I never really give some examples of what that means. So if you ever go to a Chinese temple or Japanese temple, if you go to a Japanese temple, you will see 2 deities, right, sitting in front on the 2 sides of the temple, drawing the sword. Those are the protectors. So, but if you go to the Chinese equivalent, they would have 4. Some of the Japanese temple have 4 as well, and the 4 are the protectors of the heaven. And they are in the 4 corners of that universe. So that lower one, this one right here, is called that. Is the realm of the 4 heavenly kings. So this is where they guard the heaven. When you go up a little bit more, I'm sure if you understand anything about the Chinese culture, we talk about the Jade Emperor. Jade Emperor, to someone who's actually a diva, a god that are overseen. Not the same idea as the capital G god, but in the Chinese tradition, someone who oversees the realm where the humans and the devas live. So he's right here, and then now, and then it just keep going. Now, finally, one other reference point. You know the story about Buddha sitting under the Bodhi tree, and as he was getting enlightened, appears the 3 beautiful girls who are actually daughters of this one, what we call the Mara, it's not exactly correct to call it a devil, but it's some kind of evil spirit. He actually sits on top of this right here. He actually sits right here. So this is actually where he sits, because his job is to guard any of the beings, whether it's human or otherwise, from escaping the desire realm. Okay? Now then we go further up, and it's important that we understand the word Brahma in this case. So in this case, Brahma is actually the name of one of the three gods within the Hindu religion. So this one, the Brahma, is actually the one responsible for the creation, but they separate the responsibility into two others. One is called Shiva, which I will mention in a minute. So the word Brahma in this case means everything above the desire realm, because a lot of people, we confuse it with the Brahma that's written here, that there's another thing called the Brahma. But in any case, this roughly can be separated into 8 different stratas. They are named after, they're called the 8 samadhi. So as you practice, you become more and more purified, then you can kind of move up. And as you become more purified, less constrained, less hindered by your material existence, your time would slow down. So we talk about this. So this is the 8 different levels of samadhi. 1, 2, 3, 4. 4 is further divided into these 6 regions, and the first 4 is called jhana. Okay, so this is what translates as a state of absorption. And so in the past I talked about the word jhana. So jhana actually has 2 meanings. One is that it represents these first 4 samadhi region. Another meaning for the jhana by itself means sentimentation. So as you meditate, whether you're standing or sitting, doesn't matter. If you allow your bad thoughts, your bad energy settle down, then that's what we call jhana, which translates into jhana, which then translates into Zen. So that's what Zen means, okay? Now we further divide that into 2, and then the first 4 is what we call the rupa. So in this case, rupa is called form. So in a sense, rupa gaya it can be combined, and rupa gaya in this case means all physical existence. So even though you don't have a physical body, you still have your physical existence. So in this case, I believe the form means energy. That if someone exists in a pure energy form and not in a physical form, then he is here. This is called the form realm, and then above that is called the formless realm. So if I were to say the 3 dimensions existence, the particle would be here. I'm pretty sure that the wave is here, and I'm pretty sure the wave is here. I'm not convinced that this is the place where you find where there's pure information. I'm absolutely not. I know that. Yeah. Now, of course, in the Buddhist teaching, if we are a human being, and when we die, death just means that your disintegration of your physical body. Then your physical body ceases to exist. Your energy ceases to exist. What remains is the information, the karma. So you would get reincarnated or rebirth, and you could rebirth into a human, or you could rebirth into some other form. And so, of course, you need to earn your merit in order to move up. That's a different story. But the point is that this process of having endless rebirth inside the desire realm, or even endless rebirth, even if you graduated into the form realm, the formless realm, all of that is what we call samsara. Okay, samsara. So just kind of give you the punchline, the whole purpose of Buddhism is to break away from samsara. That is truly the purpose of samsara. Truly purpose. Okay, so just a little bit more. So it's well documented. It's well documented that in the Buddhist literature that the heavenly realm, the 6th heaven realm, starting with the 4 heavenly kings, which I talk about, one day on earth is 50 years. One day in the 4 heavenly kings realm is 50 years on earth. One day on the next one is 100 years, and so forth and so on. Okay, so this is consistent with what's called the time dilation, consistent with the relativity. Okay, and so in the case of the Miller's planet, 1 hour is 7 years. That means 1 day is 168 years. So that would correspond to somewhere between these two. All right. Okay, back to the question. Who is God? Depends who you ask. It's called the Big Bang Theory. So the next question is, how does Yogi think about this? How does the Taoist think about this? How does the Buddhist think about this? How does the Christian think about this? And finally, what if I'm an atheist or agnostic? I'm just only interested in meditation. Or I'm a Taoist and I'm still interested in meditation. How does meditator think of all this, right? So let's look at yoga. Right? How does the yogi think about all this? So first of all, we have to understand the difference between American yoga versus North Indian traditional yoga. Right? For the same reason I said last time, that you have to understand the difference between chop suey and ik fu yong versus the Chinese cuisine. Okay, so what we call yoga is actually either called hatha yoga, which is forceful yoga, or something called asana, right? Asana form. And so yoga is actually much more than what's popularized in America. Yoga, the word actually comes from the North Indian word called yuj, Y-U-J, which was borrowed from a word that means yoke, which is the harness that you put in front of the oxen in order to synchronize them as they pull the cart. And so yoga, the meaning of yoga is the union of the body and the mind, or creating a harness so that you can bring the body and the mind in unison. Now, keep in mind that when the yogi talk about mind, they talk about pure mind. So in their case, quote unquote, God is a pure mind. So when they say the union of body and mind, they're talking about union of the body and quote unquote God, or in their word is a Brahma. So if I go back to this chart, then the purpose of the yogi practice is to escape the desire realm, to live, then to get rebirth into the form of the formless realm. Okay, so that's what the yogic practice is. On the other hand, the Taoist practice, and I talk about how the Taoist practice have been evolved since the arrival of Bodhidharma in the 14th century. And he was a yogi. He was a North Indian yogi. And when he came, he brought the meditation technique to the Chinese and basically changed the practice of the Taoists. So the Taoists actually evolved from being an alchemist into a meditator. But the purpose of the Tao is a little bit different, that they're actually much more focused on the rebirth into what's called the heavenly realm. Okay, in fact, I'm sure you, if you go to Japan, you would see the seven figure, one woman, six men. There's one with a fishing pole and so forth. And then if you go to China, you will see more or less the equivalent of that, but it's eight. So those are called what we call scene in Chinese, but it's I think they're like, remember you watched Reign of the Reign of the Lords? There are these people with the pointed ears that live in the mountains and they can live forever in human time. They're like that. Okay, the scene is like that. That there are these kind of spirit being that after they meditate, then they live sort of outside of the human realm, but not quite the diva realm. So those people actually live right below the heavenly realm, right below the heavenly realm. You say, well, how do you know? Well, because when I read the literature, they have this story that talks about every day is 10 years of human time, and the heavenly realm is 50 years, so they have to be below that. Okay, so the Taoist practice, their goal is to be rebirth, to be with quote unquote God, which is within them, and to be rebirth into the heavenly realm. So the next question is, where does Buddhist fit into all this? Because if we understand that, then we can begin to understand God, right? So So who is Buddha? Who is Buddha? Buddha is not a name. Buddha is just a very generic term that means whoever who's enlightened. And so whenever I say Buddha, I usually add the word historical Buddha. So the historical Buddha has a name. His name is Sikkhatta Gautama. So he was born 2,600 years ago, and he was actually he was from North Indian because he actually was born in a place that would nowadays be called Nepal, which at that time was part of India. And so he was a prince, and he was a yogi. I mean, he decided that he wants to renounce, but he actually know a lot about yogic practice before he renounced and left his family at the age of 29. So after he left, then he basically was a wandering yogi for 6 years. And in that 6 years, he seek out different teachers. So one of the more renowned teachers that he seek out taught him enough that he actually reached a seventh stage of samadhi. You remember I talked about in the form and the formless realm that there's 8 different stages. He actually reached with the first teacher. He was able to reach the seventh state, a state that is called state of nothingness. Then he was not satisfied and he wandered around. He finally found another teacher, and the second teacher taught him, and he finally reached the very top, which is the 8th state of samadhi, a state that is called state of neither perception or non-perception. And he was still not satisfied. He was still not satisfied. And the famous story about how then he gave up on his ecstatic way, and he sat down in the Bodhi tree, and he basically says that if I couldn't find the path, I just won't leave. Okay, this is what I would do. And so eventually he found what is called the middle way, which actually, if you put that in the context of the Indian tradition, Shiva, who is one of the 3 king god of their religion, the other one being Brahma, is actually also called Adi Yogi, the original yogi. And so in the past I talked a little bit about that essentially what the historical yoga did was to discover one of the 112 paths into enlightenment. And because of that, he was able to escape samsara. And this ninth stage of samadhi, the key of that is to forego the thinking mind. And I'll come back to that in a minute. So what does it mean by inventing the ninth samadhi? So remember that I said that he already reached the 7th and the 8th, right? So there's no place for him to go except to be outside of this 3rd realm, which he did. So if you talk about the Taoist practice being limited into the heavenly realm, and the yogic practice being limited to the form and formless realm, then the Buddhist practice was to escape all that. And when he did that, then he basically there was no need for him to rebirth. And so the purpose of the Buddhist practice is to escape samsara. And what the historical Buddha taught was the understanding of the thinking mind. I'll come back to that. All right. Next question. What does the Christians, how do they understand all that? Oh, sorry. So before that, I need to, this is the time when I talk about the thinking mind. So let me do that and then I'll come back to the question. Sorry, I don't have enough computer to actually see my slides. So on Tuesday I talked about a documentary that I saw a couple of days ago. And it documents the first 2,000 days of a baby's life, because 2,000 days is when the baby is ready for kindergarten, when he's 5 years old, that's 2,000 plus when he was still in the mother's womb. So we're talking about documenting the development, mainly about the development, the mental development. And what was very interesting is that until they were 2 years old, most of them, until they were 2 years old, they have no concept of who they are. And so one of the things that they showed was that they had a child, and the mother and the child together, they were looking at the mirror, and the baby, she was very functional, but yet she had no concept that the baby in the reflection was her. They have no concept of boundaries and properties and all that. They have none of that. And so and you know that that's because the brain is not developed yet. It takes 5 years and maybe more. For some of us, it takes forever for the brain to be developed. So there's a difference between the brain, which is it's an over emphasized part of our nervous system, because the brain and the spiral cord are equal partners. So we typically think about the brain, the power of the brain. We hardly ever talk about the power of the spiral cord. We just think of the spiral cord as a given. And actually, a child has very well developed spiral cord, but the brains needs work. And so during that first 2,000 days is when they slowly develop their quote unquote personality and the survival skills by developing the brain. And what's interesting is that once that brain is started to develop, they change. The turbo two, as you know, is all of a sudden they understand who they are. There's a difference in they start to make demands. They start to hoard the toys, not sharing. There are all kinds of things happen, right? And so, in a way, the Buddha's teaching is what we always call the beginner's mind, right? Going back to the beginning, where we rely on a spiral cord and less on our cerebral cortex, less on our brain, because when we talk about this thing called the five skandhas, which actually kind of describes our complete existence, going from the material to the information. So the first skandha is called form, which represents everything that is physical, not only about us but about surroundings. So this is in the Heart Sutra. We would say the eye, the nose, the tongue, the ear, the skin, and a mind. Very important that it contains a brain. And then also the outside would be the sight, the sound, the taste, the touch, and so forth. Everything that is physical falls into the form. Sensation is when the physiology engages the physics to create neurology, and all the nerve endings goes into a spiral cord. That's called sensation. And finally, when the spiral cord reaches our brain, and we start to make decisions, and then start to develop like and dislike, that's called perception. And so what Buddha is saying is that is what's causing samsara. And if you want to escape samsara, then you have to learn to let go of your thinking brain. This is interesting. This is quite interesting. So this is a good time to go back to the Bible, right, and talk about what that means. So everybody knows the book of Genesis, and I do. The book of Genesis is really interesting reading, especially if you're a scientist. Especially if you're a scientist. Just think about it. The first day is when God created light. But he created light before he created sun and the moon. So light doesn't mean light. Light actually means space. He created space, and he or she. And after he created space, there's time. And then he created what we call the four elements. When he parted the water, he created both the earth element, the water element, and the air element. Then he created the sun and the moon. That's when he created the fire element. Then he created all the different beings, starting with the non-sentient beings, the planet, the plants. Then he created sentient beings. And finally he created man, and then eventually women, mankind. What's interesting is the very last part of the Genesis. He instructed his creation. He instructed Adam and Eve that all these plants, especially the one that bears fruit, are for their consumption. And the animals are the friends. So God actually wants us to be vegetarians. But he said more. He says, there's something that you can't do. There's this tree called the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. You cannot eat the fruit from that, because when you do, you will die. Wow, this is harsh. This is harsh. Imagine, I said to my 2-year-old daughter, and says, "Don't touch the hot oven, because when you touch it, you will die." Wow. Now, if you read the literature, there's a lot of literature out there that explains what good and evil is. But actually, there's also a lot of historians that went back to the original language, which in this case is Hebrew, right? Because it's in the Old Testament, and said that the book or knowledge of good and evil just means book of knowledge of everything. Because that was a figure of speech that when you want to say everything, you include the two extremes. So when you include the good and the evil, then that's everything. So this really should be translated as the knowledge of good, that instead of good and evil should be translated as the knowledge of everything. Or just translate as the book of knowledge. Wow. If you eat from the fruit of the book of knowledge, you will die. What's so bad about knowledge? That's why we go to school for, right? What is bad about knowledge that if you eat the fruit from it, that you will die? So what is knowledge? Just look it up in the dictionary, or in my case, just do a wiki search, Wikipedia search. It says knowledge is just facts and information. It's stuff that you collect, that you acquire through experience. As you grow up, you encounter circumstances, and every time you learn something, some of them are just data, and some of them are actually experience. And through that, you gain better understanding of a particular subject. So if you're an engineer, like in my case, I'm a mechanical engineer. I start with learning about statics and dynamics, and then slowly work my way up there. If you're a doctor, same thing. You start with some basics, and then you get and that's called knowledge. So it's very interesting that when Master Jiva talks about our brain, our thinking mind, he calls it memory. Our brain is responsible for memory. So in a way, knowledge is just memory. Memory with a little bit more, but it's all about memory. It's all about collecting information and then making use of it. Well, another definition is once you gain that information, once you gain those data points, you become aware and you become more familiar with experience and facts and situations. So this is again like I'm teaching my year-old daughter, don't touch that. Right? Don't touch it. I have to tell this joke. So I used to run my company in LA, and my family lives in San Francisco, and so I would see my son only on the weekend. So of course I value that very much. So one of the things that I need to do on the weekend is to take the car off to a car wash, and so I always bring him along. And so one time we were sitting down, and I think we must be having a drink or something. He was really enjoying his time. It's nice. And all of a sudden he pointed up to the awning because it's an open space. And it turns out that he said, "What's that?" And there's little spice along the ridge of the facility. And I said, "Oh, that's so that the pigeons wouldn't sit on it." And then he says, "Well, how do the pigeons know?" Yeah, I mean, that's a good question. Just because you put the spikes on there, how does the pigeon know that they're not supposed to sit on it? Well, I said, it depends on if they were taught by the dad or taught by the mom. I said, if the baby pigeon were taught by the mom would just keep telling them not to sit on it. But if the baby pigeon were taught by the dad would just tell him, "Son, go sit on that spike." Now you gain knowledge. So knowledge is our brain. Knowledge is not a spiral cord. Knowledge is not sensation, it's perception. Knowledge is a thinking mind. Once you have knowledge, it is the basis for ego, for self, for identity. Right? So we talk a lot about identity politics, right? So it's not enough that I call myself an Asian American. I have to distinguish myself from the other American. I call myself an Asian American. It's not enough that I say I'm Asian. I have to say that I'm actually also Chinese. I'm actually Chinese. It's not enough that I say I'm a Chinese. I have to say that I'm from Southern China. That's not enough because I have to say that I'm actually I grew up in the Pearl Delta, actually outside of the Communist Party, actually in the southern part of that delta, which is called Macau. That's my identity. We all have that, right? We have it between the Democrats and the Republicans. We have it between the conservative and the progressive. Whatever. That comes from a thinking mind. But you know what? If we're talking about religion, Jesus is none of that. Jesus is none of that. People are so focused on Jesus being the Son of God, they forgot his teaching. But look at his teaching. Look at Jesus' teaching. Jesus is all about compassion, loving kindness, empathy, and equanimity. When he was nailed to the cross, he looked up the sky and says, don't blame them because they don't know what they do. Right? So, meditating on God is really about meditating on God's word or God's deed. So even though I'm not a Christian, I meditate on God because I believe God stands for compassion, loving kindness, empathy, and equanimity. So very quickly, I talk about meditative technique, especially what we practice, what we were taught by our master. So I talk about this in the past that when we talk about mindfulness meditation, the word mindfulness comes from the word the sati, the Pali word sati, which just means remember. That's all it means. Don't try to put too much into it. Always remember where's your mind. So it starts with something called knowing. Always ask yourself, do I know what I'm doing? Do I know that I'm sitting? Do I know that I'm standing? Do I know that I'm giving a presentation? Where is my mind? I can't be talking at one time and then my mind goes somewhere else. I wouldn't be able to do this. Right? If you're athletes and you need to make that last 3-point shot, your mind cannot be anywhere else but where you are today. So you got to know where you are. You got to quiet your mind. You got to quiet yourself from all the hindrances, all the bad emotions. It's only after that you start to contemplate your mind, and then you go further. Something called deconstructing your mind and emancipating, freeing your mind. So of course I can't really talk about the last two, but I can talk about the first three because that's the mindfulness of body. Again, body is Gaia. It's both the mindfulness of your eye, your nose, your tongue, your ear, your body, your skin, and your thinking brain. Very important. And then so there might be something called mindfulness of mind. I have no idea. I'm not there yet. So coming back to the question, how do I meditate on God? Because a lot of people said they actually meet God during meditation. That's why they're doing it. I'm not saying that one way or the other. What I am saying is that in our practice, we have something called 8 touches. Because remember now that the Buddhist practice is about escaping the desire realm, the form realm, and the formless realm. And so as in that process, as you quiet your other senses, your thinking mind gets very, very active. And if you don't have the right teacher or the right technique to quiet also your thinking mind, now you are actually supercharging your thinking mind, supercharging your brain. All kinds of things happen. And so it's very well documented that we have something called either the 8 contacts or the 8 touches, where your body start to have this movement. It's like sleepwalking. It's like when your mind wants to make up the difference, and your body will start to move and gyrate and all that. That happens a lot. You have itchiness or numbness. You feel cold. You feel warm. You feel weightlessness. Like you can fly now. And or the opposite, all of a sudden your whole body is sinking down, or you feel very smooth, like you're coated with butter, you're flying through cloud, or the other side, all of a sudden you feel very right. It could be any one of those. I actually never felt any of that. I did feel numbness. I talk about when I do walking meditation, I do feel numbness a little bit. And I remember going to my master and says, how do it? And he says, look, it comes with the territory. Because you're still in the desire realm and your thinking mind is overcompensating. He says you just have to keep going. It's not, you're still, and what he said is you're still a long way from nirvana. I said, okay, thank you very much. But on the other hand, I don't discount that. I know it's real. I know that feeling is real. I know a lot of people, I'm not gonna criticize anyone, but I do know, for example, even among Buddhists, they told me that they experience Amita Buddha. And I'm not saying that that's not true. I'm just saying that it's possible that they're just in a side effect. So the question is really, there's no answer. There's no answer to how you meditate with God, because it depends on what you would call your journey versus what you would call a destination. If your destination is, once you define who God is, we're in this story realm, and your job is to be closer to your God, then you might just say, well, that's my destination. It's time for me to get off. But if you think that your God is somewhere else, then that's just part of the journey. And then you don't want to get off yet. You just want to keep going, right? And then you get off in a different stop. So there's nothing that's, you just have to understand what you want to do and the process of you doing it. So to finish off, there's a very famous saying from Steve Jobs, who says, the journey is the reward. The journey is the reward. So the idea is that you find something that is worthwhile doing, you just keep doing it because the process of doing it is your reward. Now I would modify that a little bit. I said, well, the destination is important, because if you don't know where you want to go, you will never get there, because the destination is what defines the journey. But once you know your destinations, right, then you can start to figure out, where you want to go. And if God, answering the question from my student, how do I meditate with God? Well, if God is your destination, then you will begin your journey. We all begin a journey the same way, which is knowing your mind, quieting your mind, so that you have a open mind, open eyes, so you don't become one of the blind men. Okay, so that's all I have. And making up for last week, okay? Tuesday, when the sound called. I hope this one is okay also. All right, so with that, I bid you goodbye, and I'll see you. Actually, I'll see you tomorrow, Saturday, okay? Bye-bye.